the theological cover, with the Western Church stepping into the spotlight. Our dear friends in South Africa taught us the concept of the state theology, defined as theology, the theological justification of the status quo with its racism, capitalism, and totalitarianism.
Good morning. First of all, the screen is not going to get any bigger, and so if you cannot see it, there's no button to expand it. So if you are unable to see the screen, you may want to move up a little bit. So I'll give you an opportunity to do that. Let me introduce myself. My name is Lisette Acosta, and I am the new director. I've only been here for all of 3 months plus for the Center for Lifelong Learning, and it is the center that, together with other folks at Brite, puts together this event. And so I am grateful to be here with you all this morning. I just want to make some announcements. The first one is maybe the most important one. The bathrooms are down the hallway. There's a sign that will point you to them, but if you go out the sanctuary, you'll make a right turn and just keep going all the way down, and you'll see them right there. We also have vendor tables. We have a number of organizations with disciples and TCU admissions and other folks downstairs. So if you are facing the registration table, make a U-turn, and then you'll face where the elevators are. And the elevators will take you right downstairs. When you get out of the elevator, you're going to make a right again and just follow your way to the vendor tables. Down there, we also have some goodies. We'll have coffee and donuts for you, and so that's another incentive to go. The third incentive to go downstairs to the fellowship hall is because we also have TCU bookstore, and the books of all the folks who all of our faculty at Brite and other folks who will be presenting throughout the day, those books will be available at the bookstore downstairs. And so find your way down there. And I wanted to just let you know of the schedule for this morning. We will have, and Dr. Barb McClure will introduce our speaker this morning, so I will let her do that. We will have a break sometime around 11:30, and you'll be actually around 10 o'clock or 10-ish. We'll take a break, a coffee break. You can go downstairs, you can go to the restroom, and then we'll return for a time of Q&A. And Dr. Rogers-Vaughn, you will tell us when you are ready for us to break, okay? And then 11:30 will be lunch. You will be on your own for lunch, and there are a number of places just down. If you take Broadway down toward Main, there's a bunch of folks, a bunch of restaurants there for you to choose. And then we will return at 1:30 for our 3 workshops. And I'll tell you a little bit more about those workshops before we break for lunch. And so without further ado, Dr. McClure, please.
Thank you, Lizette. My name is Barbara McClure, and I am the professor of pastoral theology and practice at Brite Divinity School. And it is my honor to introduce this year's Scott lecturer, the Reverend Dr. Bruce Rogers-Vaughn. I count Bruce as a colleague and, dare I say, a friend since we met in Nashville, Tennessee 18 years ago. I've learned a lot from him, and I'm looking forward to learning more today. Dr. Rogers-Vaughn is an ordained Baptist minister and a clinical pastoral therapist at the Pastoral Center for Healing in Brentwood, Tennessee. Bruce also taught at the Divinity School at Vanderbilt University for 23 years, ultimately serving as the associate professor of the practice of pastoral theology and counseling, and he is now recognized as a visiting scholar there. He is the author of a number of essays and journal articles and book chapters, but let me commend his book, Caring for Souls in a Neoliberal Age, which I have taught in my classes and which my students have said to me has been of immense importance to them and very helpful. So I commend that book to you. In 2022, Bruce was invited to join an international slate of speakers to address the annual conference of the American Monetary Institute. He currently serves on the board of the Alliance for Just Money, an activist organization that is committed to removing the ability to create money from private banks and placing it into public hands as authorized by the U.S. Constitution. Please help me welcome the Reverend Dr. Bruce Rogers-Vaughn.
First, let me adjust this mic. Can you hear me okay? It's fine? Good. Let me first say what an honor it is to be here. I was not aware until here that Ministry Week has been running for as many years. Did someone say last night 91 years? Holy cow. So time passes. So I'm very honored to be here to address this group, and I thank you for the invitation. A couple of words to say initially. The first thing before I forget to say is I'm going to be covering a lot of ground fast. There's a lot of things I need to cover. So some of the slides, I'm not going to be reading the whole content. I'm just going to be moving. Don't worry. We are going to make this whole PowerPoint downloadable and available to all the attendees. I hope that lowers your anxiety about note-taking and so forth, so you can have that available later. So the only thing you may want to take a note on is if I make a remark in a slide that is not about something on the slide, that's all you might want to write a note about if you want to remember it. Let's see, what else? I think that's it. So do we support or subvert the empire? I know all of you have been sitting on the edges of your seat, wondering if I'm going to argue that we support the empire or subvert the empire. So let me get right into the agenda where this thing is going to move, so you know. I'm going to say a few words initially about the difficulty and necessity of talking about empire today. It's never been harder than today to talk about empire and to really be concrete about it. Two, I'm going to talk about how Protestant churches in the U.S. have been captured by empire. There's a backstory here that goes back about 150 years. So I'm going to briefly address that. Then I'm going to talk about how do we recognize today's global empire? You know, what are its features? What are the mechanics of it? How does it work? So that we can see it. If you can't see an empire, how are you going to subvert it? Then I'll talk about the consequences of empire for human suffering, which gets us into how important it is that we do work to resist and subvert the empire today. And finally, end with some thoughts on how might Christian ministry today subvert today's empire. So jumping right into it, in 1970, a musician named Gil Scott-Heron wrote a poem he turned into a song called "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised." This quickly became something of a meme, what we now call a meme, among social activists of all kinds. Well, we have a problem today, because today it is the empire that is not being televised. I mean this both metaphorically and literally. Metaphorically, you see behind this text, very dimly, a map. I hope you can see it. The global map, the dark territories are parts of the British Empire during its height in the 18th century. Well, today, we can't do this. We can't show the empire on a map, mainly because it is global. To some extent, all countries are involved in it in one role or the other, so you can't show a map of it. But in terms of not being televised, the major, what we call the mainstream media outlets, do not talk to us about empire, partly because the major corporations, which are all monopolized now, that run mainstream media outlets are part of the empire. So when they do cover stories that have to do with events that are related to empire, it's decontextualized. So we don't really see how all the dots connect into one big whole. This has been pointed out by a number of people. Recently, a book by Emerwar called How to Hide an Empire, A History of the Greater United States. Even more recently, Norman Solomon's book, War Made Invisible, How America Hides the Human Toll of Its Military Machine. These books are excellent, but the problem with them is they limit the discussion to the United States. There is such a thing as U.S. imperialism. So we can talk about the U.S. imperialism or Russian imperialism or Chinese imperialism. Those are real, but they actually are only part of today's global empire. So how are we to see this empire, and why should we see it? I want to look, first of all, as we have always had to do in history, to voices from the margin. We do need to note that the margin is getting larger during today's empire. I think it was Saskia Sassen, who teaches at Harvard, wrote a book a few years ago called Expulsions. She said, capitalism prior to now, so industrial age capitalism, with all of its problems, worked to involve everybody. Now that didn't mean it involved them constructively, but it did try to take people in as either producers or as consumers. Today's capitalism faces a world in which many, probably most, people on the planet are not needed either for production or consumption. This results in what sociologist Zygmunt Bauman called human waste, all the humanity of the world that is just not needed anymore. So we have refugees all over the world. We even have internal refugees, including in the United States itself. So let me quote three voices I'll select speaking from the margins. The first is an independent journalist named Indy, and I'm going to read this part of an essay he wrote in its entirety. If you're lucky enough to see collapse on television, just know that you're only looking forward in time, like a telescope looks backwards. The white empire collapses from its proxies and provinces first, but the weight of collapse is deep in the heart of whiteness, where most of my readers are. My country, Sri Lanka, has already fallen. So has yours. The printed money just allows you to imagine a little longer, but you're just playing Monopoly on the Titanic. Just ask the people in steerage who are already underwater. To paraphrase Gramsci, the old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of the hegemonsters. The next voice you might think of as someone who would not look like a voice from the margins. But what we're discovering today in today's global empire is young people in masses are being marginalized. So listen to the voice of this young man, Jared Brock. He's from Canada, I think. He writes recently in his blog, as nations fade in true power, they are becoming the marionettes of corporate puppet masters. But even behind the puppet masters, there's a higher master. He has moved from the cabinet to the boardroom, but he continues to sit at the head of the table. And I think he's using the masculine pronoun on purpose here. What is the he? The demon of colonialism, which continues to occupy the highest throne. Who will assassinate the false king of kings? Who will stand up and say, corporatists are colonists? Who will demand an end to for-profit corporations? Who will demand an end to the exploitation of others? And he continues, who will teach our children that lording power over others is a sin and crime, and that the only honorable way to earn a living is to personally create new wealth and value for others? Certainly not our corporate captured governments. Certainly not our fat pensioned church attendees, ouch. Certainly not our hyper-individualist, consumerist voter spenders. It will fall to those few crying out in the wilderness, the prophets, the crazies, the radicals. The third voice I want you to hear is actually, I want you to hear his voice and to see him. This is Reverend Munter Isaac. Some of you may have seen his sermon, though you will not have seen it on mainstream television. He is a Lutheran pastor of a church in Bethlehem on the West Bank. So this is a Palestinian minister. And this is an excerpt from his Christmas Eve service of this year. Hear him.
Yet another layer has been added, the theological cover, with the Western Church stepping into the spotlight. Our dear friends in South Africa taught us the concept of the state theology. defined as theology, the theological justification of the status quo with its racism, capitalism, and totalitarianism. It does so by misusing theological concepts and biblical texts for its own political purposes. Here in Palestine, the Bible is weaponized against us. Our very own sacred text. In our terminology in Palestine, we speak of the empire. Here we confront the theology of empire, a disguise for superiority, supremacy, chosenness, and entitlement. It is sometimes given a nice cover using words like mission and evangelism, fulfillment of prophecy, and spreading freedom and liberty. The theology of the empire becomes a powerful tool to mask oppression under the cloak of divine sanction. It speaks of land without people. It divides people into us and them. It dehumanizes and demonizes.
The whole sermon, it is available there. If you listen to the whole sermon, it is very clear that Reverend Isaac is addressing directly churches in the United States. I'm going to take him up on his word, and I want to talk about how churches in the United States have been captured by empire, especially Protestant churches. In her new book, The Gospel of Church, Janine Giordano Drake talks about this history. She teaches history at IU. The subtitle of the book is important: How Mainline Protestants Vilified Christian Socialism and Fractured the Labor Movement. Drake reminds us that in 1890, fewer than 22% of U.S. citizens were members of churches. Now, we talk about de-churching today. We were much more de-churched in the late 19th century. She summarizes, by and large, white Protestant churches were small social clubs that ministered primarily to the wealthy and aspirant classes. She quotes Dwight L. Moody, who said, "The gulf between churches and the masses is growing deeper, wider, and darker every hour." He said that at that particular time in history. I've inserted this slide that you can look at later just to say, by the way, church attendance is still pretty well divided by class. It's primarily in the United States the upper class who attend church regularly. The working class is only attending at about a 22% rate. But back to the 19th century. Meanwhile, Drake says, while turning their backs on the churches, the masses were in love with Jesus. Many identified as Christian socialists and formed their own alternatives to the mainline churches, the brick and mortar churches. You know, it reminds me that Paul Tillich, I think, used to write about the God beyond gods, the God beyond God. I think what Drake is, she's not a theologian, but I think what she's trying to describe is the church beyond the church beyond the brick and mortar churches. We see here a cartoon actually by a socialist cartoonist who, they often talked about Jesus and brought him into the conversation. To point to how popular the outside the traditional church Christianity was, Drake points to a novelist at the time whose name was Edward Bellamy. You've probably never heard of him. Bellamy wrote a novel at the time called Looking Backward, 2000 to 1887. So he's writing in 1887, envisioning what the United States will look like in the year 2000. And he envisions a cooperative commonwealth in the U.S. that had relocated Christianity from the churches to the central fabric of society. So churches were really not needed anymore because Christianity had been integrated into the society. It's hard for us to believe today, but there was once a Christian nationalism on the left that looked very different from the Christian nationalism on the right. Well, what Drake wants us to understand that Looking Backward, this novel, was the third largest bestseller in the entire 19th century in the United States. That's how popular this viewpoint was. This novel influenced another writer you probably have heard of, Charles M. Sheldon, who was a Congregationalist minister at that time in Kansas, who 10 years later wrote his own novel, In His Steps, What Would Jesus Do? Do y'all remember the 1990s, the teenagers and college students wearing their WWJD bracelets? Well, little did they know, they were pointing to a writing by a Christian socialist, Charles M. Sheldon. Drake concludes about him that Sheldon encouraged Christians to distinguish between the mission of Jesus the poor carpenter and those of the churches. The book struck a nerve in its encouragement to believers to salvage Christianity by rejecting what he called churchianity. The central idea here was Christianity as a commonwealth. Drake writes that these socialist Christian communities rivaled their church-based counterparts in print culture, community building, theology, ecclesiology, and missions. They planted dozens of labor churches, people's churches across the country in working class communities. They circulated their own catechisms and had their own hymnals. Who knew? They drew their inspiration from many sources, including a very popular Christian socialist movement in Britain at the time. One of the primary voices there was John Ruskin. I quote from one of his books. He says, "Whereas it has long been known and declared that the poor have no right to the property of the rich," which is what is emphasized in the United States today on the right, he says, "I wish it also to be known and declared that the rich have no right to the property of the poor." Just 30 minutes from my home in Tennessee, in Dixon County, a rural county in Tennessee, and at this time in history, in the 1890s, there was a small community called the Ruskin Cooperative Colony. It was named after John Ruskin, and it was a Christian socialist community. The community, of course, is long gone, but there's a cave on that property that's still called Ruskin Cave to this day. I'm inserting a couple of slides to say that Christian socialism was not perfect. It largely ignored, especially in the South, what W.B. Du Bois called the color line. Yet at the same time, there were a number of people in the Christian socialist movement that supported universal suffrage, and there were, in fact, African American ministers and clergy involved in the Christian socialist movement, such as George W. Woodby, who, a former slave born in Tennessee, was very active on the speaking trail, even in politics at that time, and he trained a network of black socialist preachers in the AME tradition. There were also women who were very much involved in this movement. And Vida Dutton Scudder is a good example of the hybridization that was occurring between the Christian socialist movement and the established churches themselves. She was an Episcopalian, and yet she described herself as a class-conscious revolutionary socialist. Those are her words. And the Episcopal Church in the USA today still celebrates her feast day every October 10. Here's my point. From the 1920s through the 40s, this alternative vision of Christianity became virtually extinct. So what happened? Chris Hedges, speaking not long ago, he mentions, by the way, Princeton Theological in this quote. That's mentioned because he gave this speech at a protest at Princeton Theological Seminary. But I'll read his comment. He says, "The wealthy industrialists in the 1930s and 40s poured money and resources into the church, including seminaries such as Princeton Theological, to crush the social gospel, led by Christian radicals and socialists. They funded a brand of Christianity which today is dominant, that conflates faith with free enterprise and American exceptionalism." I agree with Hedges' comment, but he misses the date slightly because it began earlier. There were two waves. The first wave of pulling Protestant churches into empire was when white mainline Protestant clergy mobilized against Christian socialism. This was basically a turf battle. White Protestant ministers resented having socialists speak for Christianity. They wanted to reserve that right for themselves, so they began to push back. Charles Stelzl and Josiah Strong, who we've normally heard talked about as social gospelers, were key in this movement. They got together. This says that Stelzl shared Strong's conviction that American churches were in danger of dissolving or being replaced within the coming socialist revolution. This is hard for us to believe today, but in the early decades of the 20th century, there was a fear among economic elites in the United States that there was going to be a socialist revolution. Anyway, Stelzl and Strong got together with some others, and in 1908 founded the Federal Council of Churches, a union of 33 of the largest Protestant denominations. Drake was able to go into primary correspondence between these ministers, as well as copies of some of their speeches, and show that one of their primary, if not their primary motivation for forming the FCC was to rival the power of the popular Christian socialist movement. And they wanted to bring these people into the brick and mortar churches. The FCC, by the way, is known today as the National Council of Churches. So we're talking about mainline denominations here. Tellingly, the first project of the FCC was called the Men and Religion Forward Movement, and it was funded by many of the nation's wealthiest business people, such as J. Pierpont Morgan, John Wanamaker, and Cyrus McCormick. Why did they get behind it? I mean, this movement, the Men and Religion Forward Movement, was on its face a pro-labor movement. It was very much social gospel looking. They had actually borrowed the language from the Christian socialists and gone into workplaces and union halls and tried to recruit working men, mind you, into the churches. Drake said this was horribly unsuccessful, but what they did succeed in doing is recruiting what we would call today the professional managerial class into the churches, so much so that in 10 to 15 years, church attendance in the United States had increased sixfold. By 1914, Andrew Carnegie was on board with the FCC, as was John Rockefeller. And the FCC was so influential that President Woodrow Wilson recognized it as the official voice of Christianity in the United States. And then there's this astonishing quote from Drake. "The Federal Council came to see itself as the shepherd of a new world Christendom, led by white Anglo-Saxon Protestants in the United States and administered by the American military." Imagine. These were not what we today call white right-wing evangelicals. This was mainstream Protestant churches. So Christian nationalism goes back a long way, okay? The Sedition Act of 1918 was passed during the war, which made it illegal, in fact a crime, to undermine the war effort. Well, most of the socialists, including the Christian socialists, were against entering the war. So guess who ended up in jail? A lot of Christian socialists. That's a way to suppress a movement. The second wave began in the 1930s. This time it was not led by clergy. It was initiated by corporate businessmen, of course, during this age, and their reaction against FDR's New Deal, which they thought was communistic and socialist. They still do, right? I mean, today, people think FDR's New Deal was socialist. So they, well, sources here I'll point you to, especially is the book by Kevin Cruz, One Nation Under God. The subtitle he means literally, How Corporate America Invented Christian America. The key player here was the National Association of Manufacturers, which still exists today, but it does not have today nearly the power it had in the 1930s. The NAM at that time was the largest association of Christian businessmen, of course all men, heads of corporations in the United States. And in the 30s, they had this ad campaign that they spent millions of dollars on. I mean, millions of dollars in the dollars of those days. And this is an example of that ad. It was plastered all over buildings in cities, billboards along highways. World's highest standard of living. There's no way like the American way. We hear the phrase, the American way. The NAM coined that phrase for this ad campaign. And we see here their ideal of the typical, quote, American family. White, dressed opulently, of course, driving a brand new US-made car. Even the dog is white in this picture. This ad campaign was a total flop. I mean, it went over like a lead balloon. Ironically, we see here, this was taken in Louisville, people are standing in line for food assistance in front of this sign. So why did this thing flop? What was going on in the 1930s? The Great Depression. Well, very few families could identify with the family in this poster. So it was just a total flop. So the NAM decided we got to go about this a different way. I mean, the agenda was really to convince U.S. citizens that being a U.S. citizen and a pro-capitalist were the very same thing. That was the agenda. So they had another idea. The thought was, let's recruit around the country white Protestant clergy who support our ideas. We'll go about this indirectly through the Christian churches. And that is exactly what they did. The first minister they approached was James Fifield, who was a Congregationalist minister in Los Angeles. He was known there locally as the Apostle to the Millionaires. He was actually invited to speak to the NAM convention at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in 1940. And at the end of his speech, eyewitnesses said the applause was so thunderous you could hear it blocks away. Well, Fifield preached that Christianity had nothing to do with social well-being whatsoever, but was focused solely on individual salvation. This quickly became known as Christian libertarianism. Fifield founded a movement he called spiritual mobilization, which the NAM quickly got behind. The liaison was J. Howard Pugh. Yes, the J. Howard Pugh of the Pugh Family Trust. He left his money, and that was formed what we now know as the Pugh Family Trust. He was then president of Sun Oil, but he was the liaison between Fifield and the NAM. Pugh and the NAM also funded his publication, Faith and Freedom. And I wanted to mention this because one of its frequent contributors was no one other than Friedrich von Hayek, who was one of the founding architects of neoliberal ideology back then, you know, the Mont Pelerin Society and all of that. He was in the center of it. And they distributed his book, The Road to Serfdom, which said socialism is the road to serfdom. They took his book and emailed, I think it was 800 copies of this book to prominent clergy around the country at Pugh's expense. The next minister they got behind was God's Salesman, Norman Vincent Peale. Peale's publication, Guideposts, was funded in its earlier years completely by the NAM and Pugh. He famously wrote an essay for Reader's Digest called Let the Church Speak Up for Capitalism. You can't get more captured by empire than that. By the way, Peale was pastor of the Marble Collegiate Church in New York City, and guess who attended his church regularly? Fred Trump, along with little Donald. I read somewhere recently that to this day, when Donald Trump is asked who has influenced his life the most, he says, my father and Norman Vincent Peale, who, by the way, conducted his first marriage in 1977. Well, the NAM wanted to reach further out, so the next person they lit upon was a young evangelist in his 20s named Billy Graham. Billy Graham was known for befriending politicians and businessmen and opposed organized labor. Strikes, he said, were inherently selfish and sinful. Concerning the poor, he said, give them the gospel of love and grace first. They will clean themselves up, educate themselves, and better their economic conditions. Sounds like a lot of political statements today, doesn't it? I should say that Cruz's book kind of makes you think that this movement just took over all the Protestant churches. It actually did not. It influenced probably a quarter of the Protestant churches in the United States. But that quarter became very much the seeds of a movement that sprang into action after the neoliberal revolution in the 1980s and that we see today. Meanwhile, I don't want to let us mainline Protestants off the hook. Meanwhile, back in the mainline Protestant churches, the social gospel was soon displaced by a progressive, and I mean by that white liberal Christianity, that suppressed talk of class conflict and replaced it with a psychologized, personalistic theology that failed to challenge wealthy elites. And one of the key figures in this was Harry Emerson Fosdick. On the Riverside Church website, Gary Dorian writes that in every way, Fosdick symbolized the sensibilities, strengths, prejudices, and blind spots of white liberal Protestantism, which took a therapeutic turn partly under his influence. I have to confess that when I was an undergraduate at Samford University in Birmingham, I was trying to escape the fundamentalist background of my Baptist heritage. I must have read everything Fosdick ever wrote. That may be why I'm a pastoral psychotherapist today. Read so much Fosdick when I was in college, taking that personalistic, individualistic turn. You may recall that Harry Emerson Fosdick was the first pastor of the Riverside Church, pictured here in New York City. This has always been the Riverside Church. There was never earlier versions. This was it. It was built from the ground up this way and stands this way today. Why? Because every dime to build this huge edifice was donated by John D. Rockefeller Jr. John D. Rockefeller Jr. loved him some Fosdick, and he wanted Fosdick to have his own church. So he literally built this church for Fosdick to be the pastor. It's important to note that later John D. Rockefeller Jr. was instrumental in lobbying the U.S. government to overthrow governments in Latin America because, in his view, they were too socialist or socialist leaning. So here's my main point of this historical review. Across the theological spectrum, left to right, churches in the United States, and Protestant churches in particular, have made their peace with U.S. imperialism and with capitalism. One result of this, according to Nancy Fraser, is the silencing of class in our public conversations. Now, by the way, don't get too uptight when I mention the word class. I'm not even restricting this just to the classical Marxist understanding of the proletariat. But by class, I mean material dispossession of people. That's what I'm talking about. So Fraser says what we are left with today on the left, we're left with progressive neoliberalism, and on the right is reactionary neoliberalism. So progressive neoliberalism is largely embodied in the Democratic Party, and reactionary neoliberalism is represented in the Republican Party. The churches, I think, have lined up on both sides of those aisles, with neither really attending to the interests of the masses, the materially dispossessed. I put this slide just to refer you to the book later. This is the best source for Nancy Fraser on this topic. I think it's an important book. The Old is Dying and the New Cannot Be Born is a direct quote from Gramsci. Highly recommended. So neoliberalism is today creating a global catastrophe, but churches are largely unaware. And if they are aware, they don't much care. So now I'm getting down to talking about the global empire. We could call this global empire by many names, and in fact it is called by many names. Jared Brock, that I quoted earlier, calls it corporatism. But I'm going to favor and lean into the term neoliberalism for one main reason. That's mainly what it's called outside the United States. You can go on the streets in Argentina and talk to regular working people and mention neoliberalism, and they'll go, oh, neoliberalism, you know. Everybody knows what it is outside of the U.S. So what is neoliberalism? I'm going to play a brief part of an interview with Noam Chomsky, whom I think in this little vignette gets right to the core of what makes neoliberalism tick.
Around the 70s, human intelligence dedicated itself to eliminating, or at least weakening, the main barrier against the threats. It's called neoliberalism. If you ask yourself there was a transition at that period from the period of what some people call regimented capitalism, 50s and 60s, the great growth period, egalitarian growth, a lot of advances in social justice and so on. That changed in the 70s and with the onset of the neoliberal era that we've been living in since.
We deregulated the airlines, we deregulated the trucking industry, we deregulated financial institutions, we decontrolled oil and natural gas prices, and we negotiated lower trade barriers throughout the world to get rid of needless and burdensome federal regulations, which benefit nobody and which harm all of us.
And if you ask yourself what this era is, its crucial principle is undermining mechanisms of social solidarity and mutual support and popular engagement in determining policy. It's not called that. What's called is freedom.
I'm not in favor of fairness. I'm in favor of freedom. And freedom is not fairness. Fairness means somebody has to decide what's fair.
But freedom means subordination to the decisions of concentrated, unaccountable private power. That's what it means. The institutions of governance or other kinds of association that could allow people to participate in decision-making, those are systematically weakened. Margaret Thatcher said it rather nicely in her aphorism about there is no society, only individuals. She was actually, unconsciously no doubt, paraphrasing Marx, who in his condemnation of the repression in France said the repression is turning society into a sack of potatoes. Just individuals, amorphous mass, can't act together. That was a condemnation. For Thatcher, it's an ideal. And that's neoliberalism. We destroy, or at least undermine, the governing mechanisms in which people, at least in principle, can participate to the extent the society is democratic. So weaken them, undermine unions, other forms of association, leave a sack of potatoes, and meanwhile transfer decisions to unaccountable private power, all in the rhetoric of freedom. Well, what does that do? The one barrier to the threat of destruction is an engaged public, an informed, engaged public, acting together to develop means to confront the threat and respond to it. And that's systematically weakened for people to become more passive and apathetic and not to disturb things too much. And that's what the neoliberal programs do. So put it all together, and what do you have? A perfect storm.
The closing scene there is an illustration, right, of what I said, from the left to the right. It's neoliberalism all the way. I think one of the best histories of neoliberalism that has been written is by Quinn Slobodian. The title is Globalists. The subtitle, The End of Empire and the Birth of Neoliberalism, is actually misleading. Slobodian is not saying in this book that empire ended with the advent of neoliberalism. What he said is that empire was transformed. So we started with colonialism 1.0, and neoliberalism is colonialism 2.0. What actually happened is white businessmen in Europe and in the United States got together, mostly in Europe. The Mont Pelerin Society is an example of this. And they said, what are we going to do? There's these liberation movements occurring all over the world, ending the power to colonize them. How are we going to regain control of the world economy? So what they came up with was rather ingenious. I'm oversimplifying, but for a pedagogical point. What they come up with was genius. They said, it's actually a bad look for us to take militaries, invade countries, and occupy them. It's a bad look, and it's economically inefficient. We can accomplish the submission of the world much more efficiently by forming a global financial system, a global banking system, if you will, put most of the world into unpayable debt, and then they will once again be at our feet. And that, friends, is exactly what they did, beginning in the 1980s and 90s. This was a fringe idea for many, many years, until the opportunity came during stagflation in the 70s. The U.S. economist Michael Hudson talks about this. He calls it finance as warfare. He says the financial sector has the same objective as military conquest: to gain control of land and basic infrastructure and collect tribute. Finance has become war by other means. What formerly took blood and arms is now obtained by debt leverage. Roos has talked about this book and this fact in Why Not Default, and notes that in previous times, meaning before the neoliberal revolution, many times the unpayable debts of nations were either written down or written off. But since the 80s, he says, this idea has become completely taboo. No debts now are ever written off. All debts must be paid, for reasons that I just mentioned. If you keep the debt in place, you can keep people subject to you. This is true on the individual household level, just as much as it is with sovereign nations. He notes that since 1982, so-called developing countries have transferred over $4 trillion in interest alone to their creditors in Europe and North America. How is that not colonialism? So in fact, Chakravarty and De Silva co-authored a book, forget what year, it's right after the collapse of 2008, I guess, and this may be 2012. The book was called Race, Empire, and the Crisis of the Subprime. And they write in the first essay of the book, neoliberal architectures and discourses of dispossession act on earlier forms of racial and colonial subjugation. In considering the unpayable debts as a trigger for the current financial crisis, this special issue highlights the racial and colonial logic of global capitalism. So, which is to say, the global empire today is still a white supremacist system. I'm not going to talk about this article that's on your screen, but I want you to read it. It's actually not paywalled. The link is right. I didn't mention that I have links on these slides. The link is on this slide. You can go right to it. But it is written by, if I can read his name, Liam Kofi Brite. Liam Kofi Brite is a young black man who's a philosopher on the faculty of the London School of Economics. And he looks across the pond to the United States at the culture war, what we call the culture war. And he says, what is this thing, the culture war in the US? So he analyzes it in this article and he says, this is a conversation between whiteness. So he labels the culture war white psychodrama. That's his name for it. Highly recommended. So this global white supremacist system is simultaneously a wealth supremacist system. This is a book by Marjorie Kelly, just came out in the fall, and she says in the book, at work in extractive capitalism is more than personal greed. It's more than individual greed. It's systematic, structural. It is a cultural worldview, a habit of mind so pervasive as to be invisible. Here's the invisibility once again. We can call it a bias akin to race bias and sex bias, but toward capital and wealth, toward ensuring that economic activities focus primarily on benefiting those who possess wealth. In order to make this even more seeable, I want to say a few words about the mechanics of neoliberalism, what makes it actually tick. And when I'm talking about this, I'm talking specifically about politics and economics. I'll get to the cultural part shortly. Kean Birch, in his book, I think, nails it. He says it has three parts. You might think of this as the proverbial three-legged stool. The first leg of the stool is that antitrust laws are suppressed and global monopolies arise. So this is a time of monopoly capitalism. Name any part of the market you want to: sunglasses, paper goods, lipstick, shoes, clothes, but also services like financial services, name any service you wish. All of this has been monopolized across the world. We talk about the free market. The market is not free because it is controlled by giant international corporations. Talk to anybody who tries to start a business today, and they'll tell you about it. The second leg of the stool is rentiership. The economy shifts from entrepreneurship to rentiership. We talk about entrepreneurs all the time as if that's what this system is based on, but it's not. It's based on investors. Investors are the key agents here. The French word rentier gets at it. What is a rentier? A rentier is someone who controls access to goods and services and charges rent to you to access it. It can be anything from housing to healthcare, education, food, information, or maybe most important of all, money, banking. They charge rent on it. And the third leg of the stool is that the whole order is controlled from the top down by a very sophisticated bureaucracy of contracts and contract law. I think there's a book by Katerina Pister called The Code of Capital. She's a lawyer, teaches at one of the law schools in the Ivy League, I forget which one. But she tells us in detail how this is pulled off. The important thing to remember about this is capitalist ideologues often want you to think that capitalism is just natural, as if you left millions of people to themselves, they would just naturally form capitalism. But Pister and others who talk about the code of capital make this very clear. This is intentional. It would not be in place if it were not conceived of, enforced, and imposed by the most wealthy people in the world who can control the legal system. To update the mechanics of this, and also to illustrate what Jared Brock talked about earlier when he called it corporatism, that corporations are now more powerful than sovereign states, or they're eclipsing the power of sovereign states. This more recent book by Quinn Slobodian called Crack Up Capitalism gets at this, as does the book by Provost and Kennard, Silent Coup. Provost and Kennard are actually investigative journalists in Britain, and they received a grant to travel the earth for 2 years. They visited, I think, 26 countries and did investigative work on the ground to figure out how are corporations bypassing the laws of the governments of the nations in which they're working. So I'll mention 2 ideas, and then I think we'll take a break, Barbara. The first one is the special economic zone. Has anybody heard the term special economic zone says? A handful of you have. Well, after today, all of you will know about SEZs. A special economic zone is essentially a carve-out. So a large multinational corporation will go into a country and buy a piece of land. It could be a few city blocks, or it could be hundreds or thousands of acres. They then literally put a border around that land, put a wall around it. Trump's wall actually goes up around these SEZs. And they hire their own security forces to control the border. In many cases, according to the authors of the book Silent Coup, the security forces of SEZs are more powerful than the standing armies of the country in which the SEZ is located. The purpose of these SEZs are multiple. They can be exclusively for banking, they can be tax havens, they can be large manufacturing districts. But here's the deal. The company that owns the SEZ goes to the country in which it's located and says, we want you to make an exception for us of all of your laws, all of them. All laws that concern labor, environmental protection, etc., just take us off the books. We're a world unto ourselves. Well, SEZ has increased. This graph shows from the 1970s at the beginning of the neoliberal transformation, and by 2018, there were 5,400 SEZs in the world. By the end of 2023, there are now over 7,000. Most of them are located in developing countries, but we even have some here in the United States. The second mechanical tool, and then we'll take a break, is called the International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes, or ICSID. How many have heard of ICSID? Some of you have. Good job. Well, all of you are going to know it now. ICSID, here is its webpage. the homepage on its website. As you'll see in the upper left corner, ICSID works under the World Bank. It's part of the World Bank, which is famously known for enforcing financialization and finance control around the world. ICSID was actually conceived of and formed by international corporations to do their own bidding. All right? It works with CESs in the following way. A large company may go into, say, Honduras. And the company then says to Honduras, look, your labor laws and your environmental protection laws, and maybe they'll name some other laws, are costing our investors profit. So we are going to sue you, the government of Honduras, for $500 million. And where do they go to sue them? ICSID. Honduras is not stupid. The government of Honduras is not stupid. And they know that if they take this case to ICSID, the company's going to win the suit. So they comply. They make the exceptions that the company is calling for. And that's how this thing ticks. So we're going to take a break and then talk about the result of all this, which is a dramatic increase in suffering for human beings and the planet. I'm actually not going to talk about the planet. I don't have time to talk about the environment. That could occupy an entire week. But that's one of the casualties of the global empire today. But I will talk to you about the impact on human suffering after the break. Let's take 30 or to, 10:30 and resume at 10:30. Then I'll finish up and we'll have some time for Q&A.